Welcome everyone. I'm just giving the participants time to populate here and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome to part 3 of our 4-part webinar series on storytelling for social and planetary change. This series of workshops is co-sponsored by the Pachiasana Institute, Counterpoint Navigating Knowledge, and is generously hosted by the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. And in addition, we have support from the Religious Studies Department at Florida International University, as well as the Department of English at Florida International University. So I'd like to thank all those sponsors. If you missed the first 2 parts, there are recordings that can be found on Counterpoint's website. The link, they will be there at least. If they're not there yet, they will be. The links will be shared in the chat by one of my colleagues to where you can find those recordings. This webinar series is free and open to the public. However, as nonprofit organizations with a lot of volunteer work, we gladly accept donations. So if you're able, willing, and would like to, you'll find links in the chat function in a moment to the sponsoring organizations. Also, if you have questions during throughout the webinar, please post them through the Q&A function of Zoom. You'll find links to the chat and Q&A functions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There'll be points of interaction with you, and we'll use these functions for question and answer. We will also, so the way this will work today is we'll have a panel discussion with Q&A from about now until about 12:30 p.m. At that point, we will take a brief 15-minute break and return at 12:45 for an interactive workshop led by Hector Aristizábal. In an effort to allow that time to be flexible, we will switch to another Zoom link for the workshop, which one of my colleagues will post in the Zoom chat. Last week, we ran out of time, and because there's so many scheduled events at FIU, we had to end the workshop promptly, and so we wanted to avoid that rush at the end in case the time goes a little bit longer. So someone will post that link in the Zoom chat, so please take note of that link if you want to join the workshop following the panel discussion. And again, the workshop will begin around 12:45 after we have a small break. I can tell you after last week's workshop, you will not want to miss it. Hector, would you like to say anything about the workshop as a little advertisement for later?
Well, I guess we will explore. We never know what's going to happen. So there are so many possible options. And of course, what I hope is that the workshop content will come out of this conversation. But we will probably use a myth or an old story to connect to the roots of our own personal stories and share that through embodiment. How does that will look like? I have no idea. It depends on all of you.
Great. That sounds wonderful. Thank you. So today our panel discussion focuses on storytelling for justice and healing. Ways of knowing and action are inextricably linked together. Stories matter for the justification of actions. In other words, stories always include notions of ethics, justice, and healing. It's important to listen to the ways in which many different bodies are affected by different narratives and stories in order for justice and healing to occur. Modern Western colonial stories, for instance, have often not been good for Black and brown bodies, female bodies, and the bodies of the rest of the natural world. Pan-Indigenous movements, the Occupy Wallstreet movement, farmers' protests around the world, MeToo, Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, and many more are calling out the damaging ways in which colonial, sexist, racist, and anthropocentric stories harm many bodies around the planet. The airing of these stories is centered on healing and justice. They point out the distortions. They point out the distortions that exist because of extant stories that shape unjust human, and human earth relations. And they demand that new stories be told, stories which aim toward the flourishing of the multiple bodies that make up the planetary community. So our panelists today are Teya Brooks Pribac, Hector Aristizábal, and Carol Wayne White. Let me just give a brief bio for them, and then we will get started. Teya Brooks Pribac is a PhD and an independent scholar and multidisciplinary artist. Her research interests include evolutionary thanatology, animal emotion, cognition, and psyche, human, non-human animal relations, animal self-determination, and liberation. Her book, Enter the Animal, Cross-Species Perspectives on Grief and Spirituality, is forthcoming from Sydney University Press. Hector Aristizábal was born and raised in Medellin, Colombia, and forced into exile. Since then, he has dedicated his life to working in war zones and areas of extreme conflict. He combines deep ecology, theater, storytelling, and activism in the creation of rituals that foment healing and social transformation. After living for 28 years in exile, Hector recently returned to his native country and now works with Reconectando, a project that accompanies the work of the Truth Commission in Colombia. Hector will also, again, be facilitating the workshop following the panel. Carol Wayne White is professor of philosophy of religion at professor of philosophy of religion at Bucknell University, specializing in post-structuralist philosophies and religious naturalism. Her books include Post-Structuralism, Feminism and Religion, Triangulating Positions, The Legacy of Anne Conway, Reverberations from Mystical Naturalism, and Black Lives and Sacred Humanity Toward an African American Religious Naturalism, which won a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Titles. So we will follow the order of the flyer. And so at this point, I would like to hand it over to you, Teya.
Thank you, Whitney, for creating the microphone. I'd like to thank you personally and the other organizers for this amazing series of workshops. It's an honor to be here today at 2 in the morning, I must say, from Australia, with Carol and with Hector, two wonderful and inspiring people who do very important work out there. I'm also very humbled because I imagine the people who have come, people in the audience, you all have your own incredible stories of healing and of justice that are helping you create a better world wherever you are on this planet. And I'd like to thank you for it. So when I was a child, I was a victim of a pedophile. He was a Catholic priest, and he told me very early on that our relationship, as he called it, was illegal and that I shouldn't tell anyone. He also told me that even if I did tell people, they wouldn't believe me. It would have been my word, the word of a child, against his words, the word of a respected priest. Now, obviously, he had a point, because hierarchies of various kinds determine who and what is heard or not heard. But that is only part of the story. The other part is that people often don't want to hear, because hearing, truly hearing, means that we have to act. And usually we only have two options: try to do something to rectify the situation, or kill that little part of ourselves that says that something should be done. And this decision is not always easy or straightforward. But even the stories that we don't hear, either because they're not told or because we choose not to hear them, they contribute to the narrative that we live by and also then pass on. I spent most of the past 15 years, I'm trying to share a picture here. Here, this is my Jason. I spent most of the past 15 years trying to hear and to decode non-human animal stories. Now, non-human animals are everywhere. They are in our metaphors, on our dinner plates. They sell us internet plans, cars, cosmetics, but at the same time, they're also invisible. What we see, as media scholar Deborah Merskin says, are representations, not the real flesh and blood individuals. And farm animals, for instance, pigs, hens, sheep, cows, and others. We tend not to think about them very much. We also don't know very much about them. What we know is that they're supposed to be eaten. But that is really only our narrative. Another screen. Oh, yeah. This is my pumpkin. Behind those eyes, there is a story, to quote Tom Regan. a different story. It's a story of a someone, not a something. And these stories, or rather the absence of these stories, because a lot of the time they remain untold, also dictate the broader narrative and support the invisibility of these someones. But when I was trying to hear the silent stories of non-human animals, I came across silent humans as well. One of the most striking testimonies came from a slaughterhouse worker, former slaughterhouse worker, I'm going to say, Virgil Butler. And I'd like to read you a couple of passages from his writing. It's just you and the dying chickens. Out of desperation, you send your mind elsewhere so that you don't end up like those guys who lose it. The guy who fell on his knees, praying to God for forgiveness, or the guy that hauled off to the mental hospital that kept having nightmares the chickens were after him. I've had those too. Most people who work this room use some sort of stimulant to keep up the pace and some sort of mellowing substance to escape reality. People tend to avoid you. You feel isolated from society, not a part of it, alone. You know you're different from most people. They have not seen what you have seen, and they don't want to. They don't even want to hear about it. End of quote. Now, the reason, of course, that slaughterhouse workers have this kind of reaction is that ultimately they're not dealing with objects. The law can say that non-human animals are property. The law can fail to recognize them as sentient beings, but in the end, that's what they are. Pulsing, breathing individuals, not much different from you and me, and they don't want to die. Now, I don't know how much experience people have had with witnessing others die, but it can be hard. There's this tremendous force inside a living animal that resists death. It's beyond conscious control in most cases. It's just that life wants to live. It wants to be. It's an incredibly powerful tendency. And it makes sense because it wouldn't be very beneficial for anyone if the tendency was to want to die. We first became more concerned with non-human animal stories when we adopted our dog, Charlie. Now, Charlie was a complete psychological wreck when he came to us. Then my partner, David, came up with this idea that he wanted to write Charlie's biography based on what we could guess from Charlie's responses to things. And the book actually did happen. It was published last year, and it's called The Grass Library. It's a bit broader than it was initially thought of, because now it includes what we later adopted sheep, so now it includes their stories as well. But the most striking story I've experienced was that of a pregnant and dying pig. That experience wasn't so much about decoding her story, it was more about coming to terms with it, or trying to come to terms with it. I agreed to look after this pig, Liza, at a sanctuary for 2 days. When I was getting ready to go there in the morning, I got this call telling me not to bother because she was going to be dead by the time I got there. Now, she hadn't eaten for days, and now she even stopped taking water. But they also asked me if I knew a healer that worked long distance. Now, I didn't know any healer, but just the mention of the healer, I just had this little vision, and I didn't know exactly what it was about. But I just thought of all that stuff I'd been reading about psychological regulation, biological regulation, the importance of relationships and physical proximity, and so on. And I said, look, I'm going to come anyway, okay? So I did go. And when I got there, I lay down beside Liza, bodies touching very gently because she was extremely weak. And I stayed there for 2 days. I'm going to try to share a picture of that as well. And this amazing thing happened. A few hours into this, she actually opened her mouth and took some water and some food. And then shortly after, she went into labor, 4 weeks premature. It was a long and painful process, about 36 hours altogether. But it did save her life, even though all her piglets, 12 of them, were born dead. But being there, present with and for this pig was just incredible. Like in a farm situation, she would have been kicked around a few times looking for signs of life and then tossed off onto a truck and sent to slaughter. But just like I was present with her, she, Liza, was also present, fully present with and in her situation, with her pain and whatever else was going on in her body and her head. She was definitely not an object or a cluster of mechanical, unfeeling instincts. She tried really hard to cooperate. She knew we were trying to help her. She was so much like a human woman in all sorts of ways, and it was very confronting. And I can't bear the thought of all those animals just like her, or my boys, my sheep, sentient and mentally complex, was trapped in those systems. So Liza survived, and just for the record, I don't think anything supernatural happened there. I think what happened was that my presence and our physical contact induced her body to release oxytocin, which is a hormone that does many things, but among others, it induces contractions. And that's why she went into labor, because later when the vet came and gave her more oxytocin, it didn't actually have any effect, because by that stage, I think her body was already quite oxytocinized, if that's a word. Yeah, here's a little orphan ducklings now. So over the past 50 years especially, what we've discovered or rediscovered is that human and non-human animals share basic structures and processes that make us all vulnerable physically, but also psychologically. And both scientists and philosophers are becoming more open in recognizing these parallels and the need to do something to change how we think of other animals, and of course, importantly, how we treat them. A lot of the time, we don't really realize how damaged an animal is, a non-human animal, but also a human animal, until we give them the chance to heal, show them that it's okay to hurt, offer them a supportive environment where they can feel safe and free. Like many violent humans are really just humans that are wounded, and they use the violence to try to hide this wound. What they really need is an opportunity to accept it. And that's why I think we need to invest in creating sanctuary inside ourselves and around us. Phoenix zones, as Hope Ferdowsian calls them, zones where the wounded can be reborn like the mythical bird, which is basically what Hector is doing out there. And another little picture of our little non-human family. So Hope Ferdowsian is a medical doctor who started off working with human survivors of violence and then included non-human animals when she realized that the reason we can hurt as well as heal is that we are animals, and our animal organisms enable both vulnerability and resilience. And she also believes, and I couldn't agree more, that as long as we tolerate violence against any sentient creature, we all remain at risk. Because we know very well how easily one goes from being a privileged human one day to a so-called dirty animal the next, and dependent entirely on ideological shifts in narrative and on representations. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Teya. That was beautiful, and it reminded me of just how embodied listening to these stories can be. I had all these feelings coming up. So, just a reminder, everyone, that if you have questions for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll return to these after the panel discussion. So next we have Hector. Hector, please take the stage.
Hey, wow. I'm just here with Liza, trying to see how that experience was of encountering an awakened human being that can be a midwife. And it looked like you were going to be a midwife into death, and you ended up becoming completely a different thing for her and some of her babies. Thank you so much for that story, Teya. I would love to share a little bit of the work that I have been doing recently in Colombia. And to do that, I'll tell you a little bit of my story. I also love, Teya, that you started with part of your story. And and it is so important that we tell our stories, because when we tell our stories, we become the owners of the story. We are no longer victims of the things that happen to us. We become the authors of our story, and in that way, we regain the authority, the authentic authority of our lives. Because things happen, and things, terrible things, have been happening in our world, and not only to humans, but to the other than human beings, and not only the animals, the trees, the earth, the rivers, the mountains. And I mention this because we are in an incredible moment in history in which both the social institutions, the social fabric is collapsing all around us, as well as the ecological fabric of life. There is these two fabrics, these two stories, the story of the world and the story of all the beings in it, and the human story, the story that we capture through culture and we capture through storytelling. And I feel that uh, perhaps the main characteristic of, sorry, I pushed the wrong button here. The main characteristic of humans is our capacity to tell stories. Nature produces originals and produces fruits and produces vegetables and beauty and animals and all kinds of biodiversity. Humans produce stories and dreams and myths and language that hopefully is inspired and reflects on life itself. We don't know yet if other beings can also create stories, but so far we do. And it seems to me that we are, as well as bones and blood and cells and viruses, we are more than 50% viruses and bacteria and fungus, and all of this is an incredible turmoil inside of all of us. But we are also stories. Stories tell who we are, and stories try to interpret the world for us. We interpret the world, but the world also interprets us through stories. When we live experiences in life and we relate that to others, we're telling a story. And I'm sure that this is not only my experience, our story is constantly changing. We are able to re-signify the events in our lives. And when we do that, it seems to me, we try to find meaning in what happens to us. And especially, I think all of us are very aware now that we have been born into a matrix of collective trauma. There is so much that has not been healed in our history, so much that has happened to our ancestors that has not been processed, and that we are all in this matrix of trauma. And trauma, collective trauma, is a concept that fortunately is becoming very present in the general discourse today. And therefore, the invitation for collective healing. And in my work and in my personal experience, storytelling is probably one of the most important vehicles of that collective healing. Art, not only storytelling and theater, in my case, is what I use the most. The films, the books that we write, and the encounters, even with psychologists and with mentors and with elders and with others in community, are all spaces for us to tell our stories and to find meaning in the things that happen to us and to find meaning in our relationship to the natural world. When I, in my story, I was tortured, I was forced into exile, I witnessed a lot of violence here in Colombia, and I was forced to leave when I was 28 years old. When I left, I was terribly wounded, filled with hatred, anger, despair, desires for revenge. I went to the last place in the world I wanted to go, which was the United States. I did not believe in any American dream, but fate has these incredible tricks to show us that we don't plan life, we just live life. And of course, when I got to the United States, I discovered that One thing is the politics of its government, and another thing is the country and the culture and the people. I fell in love 2 days after I arrived. She became the mother of my kids. I started having a life there, but I was very connected to my roots and to Colombia and to the incredible upheaval that was happening in this society, one of the most violent societies in history. I lost friends. I lost one of my brothers that was kidnapped, tortured, and killed. And that reopened my wound. It really transformed me into a serial killer. Fortunately, I had stories to do that killing. Stories in therapy, stories in rituals, stories in improvisations using theater. I was able to process, so I was not, so I didn't have to hurt anyone, and especially to hurt my children with carrying the woundedness that I had. So I started working a lot with people, with other survivors of torture, with young people who felt like they were in an accidental world and that they themselves were accidents. And so I started finding stories and myths as a way to tell, for example, a young man in prison that tells me, man, I'm here because the condom broke. So I am an accident. And then I enter into the gangs to find some kind of identity. But when I told them stories that somehow told them, no, you are a gift and you are unique in the world. And there are almost 7.5 billion people in the world, and there is no one like you. And there has never been anyone like you in the history of the world. Somehow I could see how that awakened something in the nobility of the soul of these kids. And then I started working with them and working with rituals and initiatory rituals because something needed to give meaning to their experiences. I ended up creating a play to tell the story of my own personal experience with torture and the killing of my brother. And when I told the story of what used to be my personal nightmare, the world opened. When I opened the chamber of torture, the world seemed to be very interested. So somehow I found the blessing in the wound. I found the medicine in my woundedness, and I was able to share with other people. And then I began to travel the world and go to mostly places of war and post-conflict, because there is no post-war, there's post-conflict. War is like an eclipse of all the other contradictions and difficulties that exist in a society. And when the weapons come down, often all the other contradictions come up. And so I was doing that for many years, using mostly theater to invite people to tell their own stories. Because a lot of the things that happen is that we don't have the opportunity to tell our story. I tell people, read all the books, learn all the theories that you can, but please don't forget to read your own story, to read your own book, to listen to your own story. And to be able to do that, we need places where people can listen to us. We need to create spaces for deep listening. I was doing this work all over the world, and then the peace process began here in Colombia. And what I realized is that somehow I was training myself to be able to return, but not return as the wounded, hateful person that I was feeling when I left. 28 years later, it happened like that. I left at 28 and I was 28 years on exile. 28 years later, I came back, but now carrying some of the medicines, some of the things that had helped me process my own life. And with that, I'm finding an incredible group of people that were doing deep ecology here in Colombia. We combined that deep ecology with the theater, the social theater that I was practicing in other places, and the design of healing rituals, because ritual is the place where humanity has always healed. And we created the project called Reconectando. And I would love to share with you just 1 minute of images before I talk about the program. I hope that this works. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hector, do you want me to share it from my screen?
How is it going there? You have it?
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
it. Let
please.
me share it from my
Okay,
screen.
show it from your screen. That's better.
That way it'll
Oh,
run.
that's wonderful. Please. Thank you. And let's just show 1 minute, just a few images. Eso. Wonderful. Thank you. Somehow the sound went off, but let's look at the images. Okay, I guess let's leave it there, Whitney. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe you can watch later. There are plenty of videos in our website about the laboratories that we have been offering to accompany the work of the Truth Commission. And what we do is we go to a territory in Colombia and we invite ex-combatants from all the groups, from the guerrilla, from the paramilitares, from the military, and people who work for the mafia, the Colombian mafia. We invite victims from all the groups. We invite environmental and social leaders that in Colombia have been killed and continue, unfortunately, being killed today. Is the only thing that the pandemic has not stopped is the killing of activists. And then we invite them into, literally, into the womb of Mother Nature. And there, through exercises with deep ecology, using social theater, using games and improvisations to look at life and to look at our lives and the things that we cannot resolve and find alternatives. And then with all the stories that we listen to through the rituals that we create, especially we use the truth mandala from deep ecology, from the work that reconnects of Joanna Macy. And then people are able to articulate what has happened to them because there is a space of deep listening. And then people are able, for example, to talk how the guerrilla or the paramilitaries or an armed group came to the village and raped the women and decapitated the men and forced the rest of them to abandon everything. And then there are people that belong to these groups listening to that story. And in a very spontaneous way, these people ask for forgiveness. These people see the consequences of what for them were acts of war. And war dehumanizes all of us, but the storytelling rehumanizes all of us because what they are able to see is that that other person is also a human being. And so that's more or less the work that we do, and it's giving voice to all of us to tell our own stories, because that's the way we can reweave not only our connection to each other, our connection to ourselves, but especially our connection to Mother Nature. And Whitney, I don't know if I'm done with time.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, let's leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hector. That was such a great presentation, and the weaving and healing power of stories is exactly what we want to get at today. So next we have Carol Wayne White. Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be with the other two panelists. And I greet everyone from Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, United States. I'm going to today share a different notion of story or narrative that has to do with what I call a poetics of nature. And what I want you to think about as I share this emergent narrative is that it encourages us to rethink the human. We have heard that storytelling is associated with humans. Well, I'm doing work that helps you to think about a new emergent conception of the human that honors the more than human worlds of which we are a part. Can everyone see the visuals as I speak? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So this Poetics of Nature is what I call an eco-aesthetic narrative, and it's grounded in a theoretical framework called religious naturalism. And religious naturalism basically is a emergent worldview that takes nature as ultimately real. The eco-aesthetic narrative that I will be sharing with you today is inspired by the poetic, philosophic, and literary expressions of particular iconic American figures. Individually and collectively, these visionaries, writers, and poets have countered a hegemonic narrative of humans standing outside of nature and managing nature to our own benefit. Their works collectively help me to reinscribe human as part of life's complex web of cosmic and cultural meanings. So given the limited time I have, I will kindly ask you to read the poetic passages that I show on the screen as I speak. So what is religious naturalism? Religious naturalism, as I stated a bit ago, is a new form of religiosity that departs from traditional Western ones in several regards. Oops, sorry. Let's see, I'm not sure what's going on here. Thank you. So religious naturalism departs from traditional Western forms of religion in several ways. Number one, is grounded in the scientific observational conviction that nature is ultimate. There's nothing beyond nature. Number two, it features a communal ontology. Everything is interconnected. And number three, it rejects supernaturalism in any form. A central theme of this religious worldview is that human animals are simply one branch of a seemingly endless natural cosmos. Thus, understanding the deep history of the cosmos is profoundly important for comprehending the materiality of being human, of being alive in the manner we currently find ourselves. We're also basically, as Loya Rue says, we are a composite of many interlocking natural realities or systems. Humans are also structured by relationality, as this passage from Ursula Goodenough, another religious naturalist, observes. By our very constitution of being relational beings, our wholeness occurs within this matrix of complex interconnectedness. And for humans, particularly, ways of conjoining with others that can transform us. We belong basically to a biotic, expansive biotic community, and we're inextricably bound together in a web of mutual interdependence with other organisms. So this emergent view of the relational material human is what I'm hoping you'll get from my presentation as a way of healing our diseased minds of thinking of humans as an entity outside of nature, independent from natural processes. With this particular sense of human embeddedness within myriad life, religious naturalism helps to usher in a poetics of nature that celebrates the more of life or the fullness of life. Here I evoke Peter Van Ness's notion of an embodied spirituality, one that is not centered in any religious system or tradition. Rather, it is a new mode of being here, of seeing, thinking, and acting in ways that bear witness to the relational, material human. It evokes a sense of awe, a sense of wonder to our consciousness when we acknowledge our embeddedness in the more of life. With such a narrative, as I've stated, we live, see, and die differently. For many of us, there's an element of mystery, of not knowing what may unfold in pondering our being here, and of actualizing ourselves, as Rilke intimated in his 9th elegy. Rilke's poetic vision suggests the possibility of novelty in a fuller cosmological sense, of humans becoming other than what we are at any given moment, when we are no longer captivated by the older, influential modernist narrative of humans standing outside of myriad nature. This eco-aesthetic narrative thus confronts a self-serving humanism that has posited itself as the new author of life. Here, Annie Dillard's provocative passage is illuminating and helping us consider how other life forces, bodies, modes of beings, perspectives, infinitely multiplied, share in the capacious, entangled web of life. And amid shifting ontological orderings. In other words, humans are dethroned from being at the center of what we consider to be life and the universe. Rather, we humbly rest in our entangled materiality, and we begin to recognize that there is an essential fairness to our being here, which is prior to the objectifications of I, it, that Western scientific views of reality have given us, or Western philosophical views. Simply put, we are entangled in all that is, even before we can begin to conceptualize ourselves as human beings. We are before we consider who we are. This type of acknowledgement helps us to humbly appreciate our intricate entanglement with all forms of material processes, as Hector was suggesting, what humans are composed of. With Donna Haraway, we humbly appreciate the fact that we are one among many. Even the very notion of having a human body is part of this fascinating sense of being one among many. Inspired by the poetic vision of Mary Oliver, then, we look anew, intimately, at the world that we did not make. We honor our intensely sensuous bodily expressions of animality, as in this poem by Oliver called Wild Geese. I'll give you a few minutes to pause to absorb this beautiful poem. Embracing our animality as natural creatures, humans also forsake an imaginative route to immortality, immersing ourselves in what is here, mesmerized by variegated splendor of material splendor. Transformation occurs all the time, and part of the transformation of natural life is death. In other words, we do not eschew death. We understand it as part of the natural unfolding of life. And again, Mary Oliver has paid homage to this idea of death. This Poetics of Nature also helps us to absorb the splendor of becoming our humanity in infinite ways. It's a task that can never be completed in this unfolding, appreciable universe. With other agencies and perspectives, humans become, and we become when we honor the fact that we are part of the larger whole. Annie Dillard touches upon this. Can everyone see, I hope? In her writing, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. As a pilgrim encountering the prolific sacrality of material life, Dillard recognizes that our human lives are but a faint tracing on the surface of mystery, the mystery of becoming. Such a mystery destabilizes our typical sense of knowing in the usual human pursuit of classifying and organizing the profound mystery of nature's profound alterity. Dillard's reflections also identify a profound ecological perspectivism, which suggests that our limited human perspective is part of a multiplicity of perspectives. Another figure, Walt Whitman, in the 19th century, offered a poetic rendering of the rich sensateness of materiality in his epic poem, Leaves of Grass. Whitman celebrates our inextricable connectedness with the many worlds that constitute our being here, the humanly constructed worlds and the more than human worlds without which human existence would not be. And Whitman invites us to notice and acknowledge the expansive miracle of life. Whitman also invites us to have affirmation of our basic interconnectedness. I will recite this. This is one of my favorite passages. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. This emergent sense of self from this Poetics of Nature is a relational self through and through, inviting us to resist solipsistic tendencies and egoistic impulses that lead to exploitation, violence, and other forms of death for other entities with whom we share life. Another figure is the 19th century feminist Anna Julia Cooper. In her collection of essays, A Voice from the South by a Black woman from the South, Cooper saw egalitarian principles at work in nature that helped her to speak out against ill-conceived views of race, class, and gender relations. When she was speaking out against the various forms of oppression and cultural imperialism during her time, Cooper argued that such developments are not in keeping with nature's design. Cooper envisioned the human as an important yet finite realm of potentiality within the unfolding of cosmic infinite possibilities. Equally important, in her naturalistic worldview, Cooper argued that there is a creative interplay of the one and the many, which anticipates current notions of intersectional analysis. Cooper's historical example and her sensibilities anticipate and strengthen the case for an eco-aesthetic narrative that addresses justice for myriad nature, not just human nature. From this critical consciousness emerges the possibility of cultivating a moral imagination or the significance of grasping our constitutive relationality, as Wendell Berry talks about with his notion of propriety. Propriety for Berry basically describes the fitness of our conduct to our place or circumstances, even to our hopes. It affirms the fact that we are not alone. A century after Cooper, in a much wider cosmological context, this Poetics of Nature that I'm trying to sketch here basically advocates kindness, empathy, and compassion for all natural processes, inclusive of human processes, with the capacity to influence one another and other natural processes. Humans have a responsibility to act in ways that promote the flourishing of all life, and to urge other humans, we who are compelled by this, we must urge other humans who may be less aware of our interconnectedness to do the same. Accentuating our mutual interdependence compels us to postulate ethical theories that provide as fully as possible inclusive and global analysis of intersectional oppressions. Remembering the expansive miracle highlighted by Whitman, remembering the natural sensuality of animality highlighted by Oliver, the fact of seeing and living differently highlighted by Dillard, we, I hope, can begin to see that this new emergent narrative of who we are basically is being faithful to our biological evolutionary capacity to love, to create alternate systems of interaction and forms of relationality. There's no saving us, beyond the fact that we must save our understanding of this ecological perspectivism that compels us to continue questioning our values, behaviors, and resource uses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was beautiful, and thank you to all the panelists today. I feel there was a lot of coming together between the three different talks, and for me, it's centered around the need for stories. If stories are going to be just or bring about justice and healing, these stories have to be open to relationality, open to understanding that that death, right? There is death, that there is suffering, that there is not just my story or not just our story, but there's all these other stories. So I guess I want to ask, right? How do we encourage these types of stories of openness and relationality in a world that seems to be so structured right now by nationalisms, isms of all kind, right? These stories that close one self off from another or one group of people off from another. How do you deal with these closed stories when you encounter them? And also at this time, anybody who has a question, please put it in the question and answer box. So we will try to get to as many as possible.
I don't actually have an answer. It's one of those questions I think about every day. But I think that one of the problems that we have is that we don't see life as a progress of becoming, which is basically what it is. I mean, like, I don't know about Carol, but I imagine at least Hector and myself all had, a different life before we sort of healed in a way. And I think that part of the issue is that we have to reconceptualize so-called adulthood. It's not like a final stage, like we don't, get to 20 or whatever, 21, and now we're adults and that's it. We're this closed box and let's, just not listen to anyone anymore because we're right and, our culture is right or whatever, our ideology is right. And I think that I don't know how to achieve that, obviously, but because as Hector said before, we are born in this collective trauma, and that, you know, that could be a family, it could be a broader culture, your friends if you want. And I think what we need to do is to create a space where people feel that they can be open. We are not alone, as Carol said before. I love that, you know, like when you realize how much potential there is out there for relationality, not just with other humans, even though, of course, with other humans as well, but everything else, you know, like you can talk to a tree if you want, and it's not crazy. It's just like, it's a relational thing that, you know, you can do, and it's totally fine. It helps you, it heals you, and it probably helps the tree as well. And so, yeah, no answers really, but just, I think that, I mean, every time I do open up to, say, a human and their stories and give them the space to be, they, you know, things come out of them that they're not allowed to sort of express or don't feel they can express in other situations. And I think that's what I can do sort of personally, you know, really specifically, like here and now. And collectively, I guess, if we spread this message, we can do a lot, you know. It just like has its ripple effect. Yeah.
Thank you, Teya, and thank you, Whitney, for that question. For me, as a philosopher of religion, a primary task is becoming scientifically literate, also being literate in terms of the cosmos, understanding. And the reason I said scientifically literate, the scientific imagery and language helps us to make sense of this interconnectedness. It is there, it's irrefutable fact. The composite entity of being human, we're comprised of atomic, chemical, biological processes, and also opening ourselves up to the arts. So for me, it's common sense, opening yourself up to life through the forms of knowledge that we all are helping to construct.
Thank you both. I try to say, I love that when you talk, Carol, you talk with the language of poetry, and you are talking about the poiesis, and that poiesis is this constant communion between human and nature, and us as nature. I have seen this happen in when humans enter into the womb of the mother. And talking about the topic of healing and justice, what I have seen, for example, guerrilla men who have spent 30, 40 years in the forest, in the jungle, literally, with a weapon. And then after 5 days of laboratory, of inviting them to ask permission to the river to enter, as you saw in those images, one of them told me, listen, I lived for 37 years in the jungle, but I never saw the trees or the animals as beings. I saw them as trees and animals. And I didn't destroy them just for destroying them. I kill an animal to eat it, or to protect myself, or cut a tree to create a place to stay. But that shift on awareness that the poiesis of life is all around us. The image that we're using a lot now is the image of the mycelium. When something dies in nature, the mycelium comes into that rotten tree and extracts everything that serves life and continues creating life from that decomposing body. I think that poetry and storytelling and myth is our effort to do the same with the woundedness of human, of what we as humans are able to do to ourselves, to each other, and to the Mother Earth. Because of these stories of separation that we're trying to now integrate, that humans are separated from nature, that men from women, the left brain from the right brain, the logos from mythos, intuition from logic, etc. So now we are in this beautiful moment where the poiesis of life is all around us. And we had to thank COVID-19. With all the pain that it has brought to us, it has been the only thing in history, in our history, as I understand it, that said, stop the way you're living and pay attention. and go back to the essential. And I think that part of what is happening right here, that we are in this ongoing conversation.
Thank you so much. Those are three beautiful reflections. And thank you. I do have a question, one for each of you actually. So maybe we'll do this. So Teya, the first one was for you. And this participant says, I used healing on my dog for his all of his 15 years. The day he died, I kept him alive, and then I felt I was holding him back. I was lying beside him. I said, if you want to go now, Hamish, you can go. He got up, walked to the back door, and died. And the participant says, do you have any comment on this?
I'm actually not sure I can talk about this without crying, because our Charlie passed away last year on the 26th of October. So it's on Monday, it's going to be the anniversary. And it was just this really, well, it was a kind of pretty peaceful death in a way, but it was also very traumatic in a way for me, because we have sheep as well. And at night we'd normally go for a walk all together. And in his last stages, Charlie had cancer. We couldn't do anything anymore. And so it was very weak, and I would carry him in my lap and we'd go for a walk like every day, but I was carrying him. And the sheep totally understood what was going on. So they didn't, anyway, long story. And so I brought him back that night and I put him in his bed. Well, he had many beds around the place, but he's sort of the bed where he'd spend the night normally. And I put the sheep to bed. And my partner was here with Charlie, and Charlie had this what do they call them? This when he, those ticks, not ticks, sort of. I can't remember the word now. But anyway, he started to die, and but he waited for me to come back, sort of. Well, that's what my partner was saying. And so when I came back at last, he was able to die, sort of. So I think that, yes, they do have this capacity. They're very much present in their life, and obviously also in the process of dying. That's why I think it's just so horrific what's happening out there. So I'm glad your dog was able to let go at last, and that you were there for him or her. Thank you.
Thank you, Teya, for sharing that with us. Carol, the next one is directed to you. It says, first of all, thank you for your talk on religious naturalism. As a non-native English speaker, I had difficulty following the explanation of what religious naturalism is. I understand that it is the worldview where we act from the knowing and feeling that we are animals and connected with everything around us, living and non-living. But is it more than that? Am I a religious naturalist if I see and relate to the world this way? Is it a group? What is religious about? What is religious about it? Could you try to explain it again in some simple words?
I'll try, Whitney. Thank you. So religious naturalism is an orientation. And I would say there are two basic features of it. Number one, it begins with a scientific understanding of reality, of materiality, reality, which means that it rejects any form of supernaturalism. Number two, if nature is the ultimate object of what is and is ultimate reality, then humans respond to that with a sense of awe and wonder. So the religious part of religious naturalism is rejection of strict scientism that says it's just atoms and all. Like religious naturalists see that there's a certain sense of awe and wonder to even what scientific theories describe as nature. And crucial to that, again, is that interconnectedness, that communal ontology. I hope that helped.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always say to my students that when I'm teaching my earth ethics class, which is religion and nature and environmental ethics all smashed into one, but I say there's religion and ecology, which is trying to adapt world religions to be more environmental, but then there's religious naturalism, which is making a spirituality out of contemporary sciences or something like that. That's how I try to, yeah. Thank you, Carol. Hector, the last one is for you. I would be interested to hear if Hector's work is affected by the pandemic.
Well, I don't think there is any being in in the world today that is not somehow affected by the pandemic. But that's another story. Is the terrible story is that we transform a virus that we are more than 0.5% of into an enemy, and the public enemy number one. And it has affected us in so many ways in the way we deal with it. But at the same time, there are these old stories that remind us that viruses are just upgrades of the genome, and that are telling us how we are destroying our environment. We're destroying the way we create food, and therefore we destroy our gut, which is the immune system, ecology of our immune system. Uh, it has affected us. Of course, we are not allowed to come into nature with groups of people. But then there is these other incredible networks that have been opening up through virtual ways. And it's difficult to imagine ritual virtuals or virtual rituals. Yet I am finding that like today we are here and somehow we can connect even through these very small windows. And there is such a streaming of information and beauty and the desire for transformation that is happening everywhere. Yes, there is the streaming of Netflix, but there is also a streaming that if we are open, we are discovering that we are the vessels and we are the midwives of this new world that is coming through. We are in this liminal space, as in Rites of Passage. The world as we knew it no longer is. That world has disappeared. That world we call normal, that was never normal, is gone. But we are in this place of uncertainty. We don't know where we are, but we are walking into this new world that is coming to us that I hope includes the poetics of religion. I love a religion in which the scientists are the poets. So please, I will go there. But so yes, it is affecting us. I hope that it's affecting us in the only way that we can be affected is to serve life.
Yeah, I often talk about the sort of pandemic time and how, we're like you were saying, we're usually so caught up in, many of us at least, especially in the modern sort of world, are caught up in this fossil fuel time where we're flying around doing all this stuff. We don't even have time to see the world around us. And I feel like some of us, especially, or at least I have, been able to slow down, right, and take a breath and notice the cracks in the facades of everything, and sort of open up to new planetary realities because of that. Um, so I want to I want to ask a little bit of a different question, but related, for all three of you. And you all sort of hinted at this a little bit, but you know, how do we tell stories about without telling stories for people and other animals and things? So I'm thinking of, I want to share stories, but I don't want to, they're not necessarily my stories, but I want to share them with my class or a group of people to say, look at all these great stories. But I don't, how do there's a problem of speaking for people in anthropology or in religious studies or anything like that, but also speaking for animals. How do you let the rest of the natural world tell their story without it just becoming a human projection of that story? I mean, obviously we can't erase our humanity, but how do we tell the least sort of non-anthropocentric version of the stories of the rest of the natural world?
I'll just jump in. I love the question, Whitney, because that's one I struggle with. I think any scholar, any person who's trying to talk or interpret struggles with that. I think for me, it's a matter of aspiration and motivation. I aspire to bear witness to what I hear and all. So I am not trying to substitute the subjectivity of that which I'm sharing. I'm wanting to bear witness. So that's the best way I try to make myself feel better about this work and all.
Thank you.
I totally agree with you, of course. I again didn't have an answer other than what Carol just said, but I must say that my world is normally my relational world. is normally very nonverbal, except there's a lot of verbal stuff in my life, like when I read and write every day, but when I relate to other, and it's mostly other than human in my life, it's very nonverbal. So it's awkward to talk about it because I don't normally do it. But it's, it's just a conglomerate of sights and various sounds, of course, and smells and everything. But I was just thinking, the other day it was raining and I took my sheep in the morning. I give them like a treat, pellets, with grass pellets, compressed grass, they love it. And so I took it to their barn and I slipped and I fell over, and all these pellets, some of it spilled and the others were still in the container. And I lay there, I was, my leg really hurt and I just needed that little half a minute or a minute or something just to recover before I got up. And the sheep sort of freaked out, and sometimes suddenly that happens, they just sort of jump off. And then they all gathered around me and they didn't touch the pellets, which, it was very nice. They were obviously more worried. Now, again, this is an interpretation, but normally, because they love the pellets so much, they would just go for the pellets. They just all gathered around me and sort of very kind of carefully approached me and smelled me. They were trying to work out whether I was okay, I guess. And there's so much that happens out there that humans don't know about because, they don't speak our language. They don't yell necessarily when they're happy. They may leap, or they may just sort of sit there and smile and, smell the flowers. Like it's spring here now. And, some mornings I go for a run every morning and it's just before, the humans are out, and it's just beautiful, just out there with the flowers and the smells and these other animals that I encounter. So it's really hard to talk about this when you sort of tell it to other humans or try to tell to other humans. First, of course, you're limited in what you can tell because, again, you're interpreting, you're missing a lot of stuff because you're just a human. You don't have all the senses developed that they do. And well, Hector will know about this too, being right there in the middle of it all. And it's just difficult, but you try to tell it because it's just, again, important that we do make human people aware of this other world out there that is so close to ours, so much like ours, but it's not really.
Thank you.
Yeah, hard to answer the question. What I hope is that we are all remembering that there are many other languages, that there are many other ways of communicating, of feeling, of evolving with that which is around us, informing us. When you go on a vision quest, for example, and you are in the forest or in a desert, and with just 3 days of silence and ayuno and not eating, all your civilization is gone. And then all of a sudden, at night, you see the Milky Way and you see the milk coming and feeding you, the cosmic information. And you see that the sky is filled with billions, literally billions of stars. And then you start seeing the one that has your name. Then the Roger Rabbit comes to you and comes very close to you and is able to come close. And at night you hear the coyotes howling. And the first night you feel that they are going to tear you apart. And then the other 2 nights you howl with them and you dance in the night. But this is happening every day, but we have so much noise in ourselves. Thich Nhat Hanh was asked to tell what was the most important thing to do right now, and everybody was expecting one of his amazing things. I said, just be quiet and listen to the pain of the earth. And there is so much pain right now that we need to heal. And I felt that, that these conversations are an effort to see how we can all heal together and listen to the pain that we have caused and the beauty that we can also create.
Thank you so much. Let me ask the three of you if you have a question for the other, by any chance.
Well, I sort of have a question, but you don't have to answer it. I mean, like if it's too complicated or irrelevant or whatever. Was there like an encounter, whether it was like human or a non-human or something that sort of set you on this path of, say, transformation, or like that's a kind of cliche in so many ways, but sort of sort of opening up to the rest of the world. Because I presume that neither of you were sort of, including Whitney yourself, born into that kind of expanded consciousness, into a family that necessarily, came from a more open, with more open views like you hold at the moment. Was there something specific that happened, or it was just a process?
It's very funny how the question comes after the answer. I was just sharing one of those moments for me, and it was a vision fast and a vision quest, and being in the desert. I had lived a very anthropocentric life, very humanistic, always working with people. I never damaged the natural world, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't. And I'm saying this like this with shame in my heart, but I'm saying so none of you, whoever is there, has to be as old as I am, to be as anthropocentric as I have been. And because I have not really listened to nature, even if I respected it, I look at it with beauty, with poetry, but to really listen, and probably the best thing is not apotheosic. I had been traveling the world, working in many different places, but 3 years ago I came back to Colombia, and I lived only 4 months in the city, and I said, the place there where my girlfriend was taking me on weekends, or every 2 weekends, one day I say, I'm not going to live this way, and look at this place. And now, just in a year, and especially because of the pandemic, I'm growing my own food. I can't wait to finish this, to go and put my fingers in the soil. I'm growing roots under my feet, and now I have a little dog, which is like having a little baby. But I try to see why he's here with me. So yeah, every day there is a moment of eternity waiting for us, as William Blake said, and it is there everywhere in the things we touch, in the things we look at. So thank you for that question. I feel that that's how I want to live my life, is being able to hear the voice of beings other than humans as well, and also with humans, because we are not very good at listening to each other either, or giving each other space to tell our stories.
Thank you. And I'll jump in quickly. I appreciate the question too. I think there are two levels of an answer. I have always lived close to either the ocean or bodies of water, and I feel fortunate. A home up in Pennsylvania, I lived right on the banks of the Susquehanna River. So my world, or my worlds, really, my primary worlds were the more than human worlds. And I would go kayaking and sit out. I also, and now I'm here in a beach town, and I walk the shore. I honor the various forms of life that I encounter. But I think even more than that, I have had more than a 25-year relationship with a parrot whose name is Fern, Senegal parrot. She's my beloved. And she has taught me so much about the beauty of more than human subjectivities. For me, the tragic dimension is she died July 1st of this year, and I'm still grieving her absence in my life. And also, it's through my personal day-to-day love relationship with Fern that I even got into religious naturalism, because the theoretical framework of religious naturalism made sense for me in light of my uncanny love connection with Fern, my beloved. So that's my answer. Thank you for the question.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing those stories. And I'm sorry about Fern. We do have one more question, so I'm not gonna, I'm gonna avoid telling my story now. I'm gonna go to this other question because I don't want us to run out of time, but I'll be happy to tell you my story anytime. So we do have another question. It says, I would be interested in hearing a bit about how our panelists use storytelling as an academic research method, also in regard to translating very emotional and transformational content, again, into the academic frame. So how does this work? Or do you use this as a pedagogy in the classroom, and how does that happen?
Well, I'm going to, it's not necessarily academic, but now when we do work, we need to justify what it is that we're doing for the funders and the NGOs and the government, etc. I shared that we are doing the work Reconectando to accompany the work of the Truth Commission. And what is the truth? It's almost an impossible task that the Truth Commission has, and only 3 years to explain what happened and why it happened. Why we have been killing each other for more than 60, 80 years, and even before that. So I recently heard a beautiful story by John Croft, and it's a very short one. It's a king that has 2 daughters, and one is named Truth, and the other one is named Story. And they are always competing. And one day they decide for the ultimate competition. They are going to go into town and see who can gather the most people. And Truth said, I go first. And just to be completely bold, she gets naked. And she walks to town and people run away. And they look at her behind the curtains. And she comes home devastated and crying. And Story tells her, why are you crying? And she said, no one came. And then Story says, come on, sister, let's go out together. And when Truth, Naked Truth, and Story came out together, people gathered. I feel that our work is somehow use storytelling to tell the truth and the naked truth, because stories have that capacity to bring information and imagination together. And I cannot think of a better way to teach, and in any context.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add, in my field, there's so much being done on studying the brain and arguing that humans are symbol makers through language. So I often use a lot of the work of evolutionary anthropologists and neurobiologists, people like Terence Deacon, et cetera, who actually argue that humans basically are constituted to be storytellers. And they justify it through understanding, again, the materiality of how we're constituted and how our brain operates. And that allows me to do this in a way that is so-called valid, within the academy. But I agree with everything that's been said thus far.
Well, yeah, me too. I mean, obviously there's, you can't really sort of get people to open to, I mean, like you can tell them facts, but facts themselves are like really kind of dry and cold and boring, and you do have to give them examples. And like science is sort of doesn't like stories that haven't been tested over and over again, but like that's their problem really. How do you I mean, like we'd have such a limited view of everything, and science to certain degrees does have this very limited view, and that's because it doesn't want to open up to, or is trying. Actually, people are really changing these days. They've been a little bit more open to other kinds of evidence and storytelling as well. But it's important. It's definitely important. I mean, most of what we know comes through stories anyway, in one way or another. So yeah, absolutely, stories all over.
That's wonderful. Thank you all. And I would just add to that actually one of my my final project for my student in this Earth Ethics class is watching this 4-part webinar and then constructing their own eco-autobiography in terms of how they, what's their story of their own relationship with the rest of the natural world and how it's changed and this sort of thing. So, so that's one way I'm using it in an academic context. Any final thoughts from the panelists? Carol, we can start with you, and just any final words.
Yes, I'm actually curious. This is for everyone, not just the other panelists and you, Whitney, but I'm curious as to what people are thinking about in terms of the notion of vulnerability and shared vulnerability as a mechanism for helping to heal and transform and change the stories around the idea of embodied interconnectedness. So for me, vulnerability is a huge word, and there's a lot of richness associated with how we can explore that. So those would be my final thoughts.
Thank you. It's always good to leave with a question. Always.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say that thank you again for this opportunity to think through things, and also to have met Hector and Carol, and actually, laid up and exploring their work a little bit. And I will keep doing that because it's just wonderful. Both of them are wonderful, and I can't wait to read and listen to more.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Hector.
also deep appreciation for this opportunity, and and I hope that the people who listen to us got something out of this. I love that idea of vulnerability. I think that we're vulnerable when we speak. That I share this notion of the blessing in the wound, or the medicine in the wound, and that's what I experienced my whole life with my own personal story and with other people's stories. That when we are able to open and to enter into that tunnel that we have been afraid of our entire lives, we can see what is at the other side. But we have to go through it, and we have to be ready, and we have to be vulnerable, and we have to be bold. But that's where beautiful literature is. That's what scientists discover things. That's what poets do all the time. Is they become vulnerable to life and forget everything they think they know, so they can really learn something. And that's an invitation to all of us. Is in our vulnerability is our wealth, is our richness, is our power. And thank you all.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you for being here, for joining us. And I'd also like to big round of applause for our panelists. And I also want to thank all of our co-sponsors and hosts, the Pachiasana Institute, Counterpoint Navigating Knowledge, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University, the Religious Studies Department at FIU, as well as the Department of English at FIU. And remember, we've just posted, if you want to join us for the workshop, we'll take a brief pause, and then the link for the workshop has just been posted in the chat, and I can actually there it is. Okay, there it is again. And so what will happen is this platform will stay on, so you can have access to that link until about 1 p.m. But then after that, this Zoom will close. So make sure you get that link to join the workshop, and please do join us. Also, don't forget to join us next Wednesday, October 28th, the same time, for our final part of this webinar series, when we will focus on storytelling and re-narrating. What new stories are being told, and what new stories can we tell? With panelists David George Haskell, Bronte Velez, and Alexandra Cornelius. And then it will be followed also by a workshop that's led by Bronte Velez. So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and be well, as my friend Carol says, and see you later. Thank you.